culture and religions, Greek different religions, and the syncretism, Greek education, the polis structure, all of these things remained in the East throughout the Roman rule of the East, all the way up until the time you had a Christian emperor with Constantine and later. But there's one thing that the Romans made even more of than the Greeks had made of, and this is the patron-client structure. This is a bit more of a distinctly Roman institution, even a legal institution, but it's important for understanding both the Roman Empire as well as early Christianity and its patron-client relations. The household structure of a Roman household was this. And I say household because our word family, which we usually take to mean the biological family, the father, the mother, the children, maybe the grandchildren, maybe the extended family, but we usually mean by it the immediate, the nuclear family with some extension. That use of the English word family, although it comes from the Latin familia, means something totally different in Latin. The Latin word familia didn't mean that biological kin group. It actually was originally used for the slaves of a household. The slaves and the freed persons of a Roman household were legally the ones who were the familia. But so when I say family, we try to avoid even talking about the Roman family because it means something so different to them than what it means to us. So I'll tend to talk about the Roman household because that's what's more meaningful sociologically when we talk about this. The Roman household was constructed like a pyramid. Imagine this is a pyramid, not a triangle. At the top of it is the head of the household, the man. The pater familias. Now, increasingly, you'll actually see this written in the New York Times or used in politics, but it comes from the Latin, and it referred to the head of the household. Pater, father, familias is the household, the family. The pater familias is the oldest man of the household. Under him is his sons, his daughters, and then at the bottom are his slaves, and here are his freedmen, freed persons. And then also you consider in some ways free people who may exist as clients. But legally, the word client in Latin refers to the freed slaves of a paterfamilias. Now, where's the wife in this picture? Notice I didn't put the wife and the mother in there. Why is that? Because legally, she's actually not part of this man's household. She remains part of the household of her father. And she's legally under the control of her father probably, or her brothers if her father is dead, or her grandfather if her grandfather is still alive. But since life expectancy in the ancient world was much less than ours, you didn't have usually several generations in these households because older people just died. The wife, though, is legally a part of her own household over here. Why did the Romans do that? That's very different from the Greeks, very different from other people in the ancient Mediterranean. Why did they want to make sure that the daughters stayed in the households of their fathers? They did this because they didn't want the upper class in Rome, who were the elite, they didn't want any one household or any small group of households to become too powerful. And if you have women marrying off into other families and then they leave the household of their fathers and they are officially and legally a household of somebody else, that may end up increasing those households that have intermarriage coming in and not so much intermarriage going out. By keeping women under the household of the men of their original family, the upper class Romans tried to balance these different households in size and importance. They didn't care about the lower class, really. The lower class didn't really count much. What they cared about, because the Roman Republic by this time was basically a bunch of very important households, wealthy men and their households. And they were the members of the Senate. They were the knight class. They were the people who ran Rome. So they didn't want one king to arise, and they didn't want a small coterie of leaders to arise. They wanted there to be some kind of balance of power among the several major households of Rome, the families of Rome. Now, slaves obviously are under the paterfamilias. When a slave is freed, and in the ancient world, in Roman Empire, most slaves were eventually freed unless they just died before long. they became a freed man. They didn't become a free man, they became a freed man. And that was legally different. So the status of slave was lowest, freed persons was next and highest in Roman law, and free people were next. But even though they became freed, they were still considered a member of this guy's household as his client and his freedman. And they owed certain duties to him. For example, they might, paterfamilia would often put a slave up in business, give a slave enough money to run a business, and that the slave could keep a lot of the income from that business for himself, and the slave could actually gather together a bit of money for himself. He couldn't legally own the money. His master legally owned everything the slave owned. But practically, and in some legal context, what they would do is they'd allow the slave the use of that money, and that's called the peculium. Now, when the slave is freed by the owner, the slave could take the peculium with him, and then he could set up his own business, but he'd still be a client of the owner because he's still officially part of his household. So this maintained even when, and why would a person free a slave? Well, if you have a slave, that slave can't actually sign contracts. The slave might be your business manager, but all the slave could do is the paperwork. But if you need a slave representing your business and you live in Rome and you need somebody in Ostia, the port city of Rome, to be able to be there and watch your imports and your exports of your business, you need someone who can sign contracts, who can lend money, who can borrow money, who can do things like that. Slaves can't do that legally, but freed men can. So rich Romans were often freeing slaves for their own purposes. It was not like they were giving them a great deal. This was part of their constructing their own business expansion. Sons and daughters, though, were still part of the household as long as the paterfamilias was alive. So sons legally were still under their paterfamilias. Now, this is all legally and officially was the case. You wouldn't really see this working all like this. For example, I said wives were not really part of their husband's household. Legally, that's correct. But you see cases in letters and all kinds of stuff from the ancient world that women actually were more unofficially part of their husband's household. They ran it when he was away, for example. They told his slave, she might have her own slaves and her own property. The wife had her own property that was separate from the husband's property. But in practical purposes, most of the time, they just mixed these together and they might use different things. So the legal situation was set up to try to keep the wife's ownership as part of a different family, and so her money didn't go to her husband, and his money didn't go to her. But this was a legal situation to try to keep this balance of power among households. Practically, sons didn't all live in the same place with their father. They would get married and move off to an apartment or someplace down the street or to another city. But this is the legal situation. Now, when you go to jail, when you go to court, slaves, of course, can't represent themselves in court at all. They don't have any legal standing. But if you're a freed man, the other thing I should tell you is that in Roman law, if you're manumitted as a slave, you're made free. If you're manumitted in the normal way they did it, that makes you a Roman citizen if your owner was a Roman citizen. Notice what this means. Only in the Roman Empire could slavery actually start being a way that you could move up in society. Because if you were a talented slave, your owner might free you, probably would free you. When he freed you, if he was a Roman citizen, you would automatically become a Roman citizen also. And your children would be Roman citizens. And although you were a freed man, which was lower in status than a free person, there was some privileges you couldn't have, your children would be, if they were born after you had been freed, would be free people, not freed. So within a couple of generations, people could move up from being the lowest slaves to 2 generations being free Roman citizens. So Roman slavery and the freedom of that was actually one way that a few people in the ancient world recognized some kind of social mobility, which was very rare in the Roman Empire. Any questions about any of that? Now, why is this important for the rest of the stuff? This will be very important because Christians started out as house churches, and their house churches fit sometimes the model of a Greek ecclesia, an assembly, but sometimes the model of the Roman household. And so this household structure becomes very important for the growth and structure and even the theology of Christianity eventually. This is also important, though, for Roman politics. Because if you're a freed man, or even if you're a free person, sometimes see free men would connect themselves to a powerful Roman who's higher status than them because they could use him for important things. For example, say you want to take your neighbor to court because your neighbor is starting impinging on your land. Well, if you're of lower status, lower social status, the judge is going to look at you and say, come on. You're poor, your neighbor's rich, I'm going to side for the neighbor. Because Roman legal structures, and they even said this in Roman laws, if you're a judge and you have a rich man and a poor man in your court, of course you're going to decide for the rich man. Because the poor man has incentive to cheat. He's poor. But the rich man already has money. He doesn't have any incentive to cheat. That's their logic. But so Roman legal system was really geared toward the wealthy and the people of high status. For that reason, if you wanted to win a court case, it helped, or have somebody represent you in politics, all kinds, it helped to have strong patrons. So you have a patron who would be higher class, richer, more powerful, have some political power. And you would be loyal to your patron, and your patron would then represent you in court, try to get you jobs, try to get you more business, do all the kinds of things that patrons do for their clients. Also, if your patron wanted to run for a city office, your patron would expect you to be loyal and vote for him. So lower class people, now what happens though when you have, your clients, your freedmen, your sons, your daughters, all these are part of this pyramid structure, and they all benefit from a strong paterfamilias, and he benefits by having a strong household and a large household. But most of the free citizens of the Roman Empire, of Rome, were poor people, free and even citizens, but they were poor people who weren't part of any rich household. So what do you have with all these other people, these other Romans around here, who don't have a powerful patron, who don't have a powerful patrilineal to help them out? This is where Julius Caesar was quite the genius. Julius Caesar came from a patrician family, that is, a family of an aristocratic family, but he started siding with a party in Rome called the Populares. And I think this is on your handout, correct? The Roman Senate in the late part of the Republic, started dividing itself into two sort of parties, not official parties, but factions. The optimates, meaning the best, tended to support the interests of the wealthy senators and the few wealthiest families. The populares started representing the interests of everybody else in Rome. That populares just comes from the word for the people. Julius Caesar was from one of these aristocratic patrician families, although his family didn't have a lot of money. They weren't really, really wealthy. But he had great birth, and so he started getting more power politically and financially by setting himself up as the patron of the patronless. Generals ran their armies this way. So Julius Caesar, if you were really going to be important in Rome, you had to serve as a general at some point. Julius Caesar capitalized on his role as a general of a large army that was at the time winning battles in Gaul, the modern France. One example about this is of how Julius Caesar was the patron, the paterfamilias in a sense, of his army, his soldiers, is that one time the Senate, who got nervous about Julius's growth in popularity and power, they wanted to take some legions, some Roman legions, away from Julius Caesar in Gaul and send them to another general in Syria. The reason they did this was because they wanted to take some of Julius's power away. They were afraid he was going to set himself up as a dictator, which of course he did. So they took these Roman legions away and they sent them to Syria. When they left, Julius Caesar, out of his own pocket, gave every soldier in those legions a year's pay. This is what patrons do, you see. He bought the loyalty of his soldiers when they were being taken out of his control. This is the patron-client structure at work in the Roman army. Julius also then set himself up in the city when he started gaining more power in Rome. Actually, he gained power in Rome mainly by military might, by kind of making the Senate nervous and winning a few battles. And that was against the law. It was against the law for Julius Caesar to do that, but he did it anyway. He tried to consolidate his power, though, by putting forth policies that moderately helped the lower classes. He didn't cancel taxes, cancel debts, but he mitigated debts. He, eased some of the strains on the poor. He was assassinated by conservative Senate forces, Brutus and Cassius and others, on the Ides of March, as you all know, March 15th, 44 BCE. He had adopted another Roman, Octavian, and Julius Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, then formed an alliance with Mark Antony, who had been Julius Caesar's friend, and a lesser-known figure named Lepidus, whom you don't really need to remember, because in the end it turned out that Mark Antony and Octavian fought a civil war. Octavian won, and Octavian defeated Mark Antony, and by this time Mark Antony had palled up with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and Octavian beat both of them, and he became the sole ruler of the empire in 27 BCE. He refused the title of king, and he took the traditional republican titles. One of his propagandists said this about him: the pristine form of the republic was recalled as of old. Or Augustus, he had taken the title Augustus by this time, which means the Great. He himself said, I transferred the republic from my power to the dominion of the Senate and the people of Rome. In other words, in his propaganda, Augustus basically said, I'm not a king, I'm just another senator, and I'm giving the Senate and the people all their power back. A lie. All lies. See, lying in government didn't start with our government. So Augustus actually reconstituted the Senate, and it was just that, a Senate reconstituted by the emperor. He became more and more the patron of all the people. And this is the way the emperor would forever then try to present himself. He and his family, the emperor's family, was in a sense the patron for the whole people of the Roman Empire, at least for all the Romans. The paterfamilias of the entire empire. This has led to what we famously call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, because you had the end of long hundreds of years of civil wars and other wars, at least within Rome itself. There were always battles and wars going on the boundaries, the frontiers of the Roman Empire, but within the central part of the empire, there was an amazing period of peace. Most people saw this peace, many people in history say it is good. It's debatable whether it was good for everybody. Non-Romans and poor people may have seen the Pax Romana as more oppressive than a liberation, just like people saw the Pax Americana that way after the collapse of the Soviet Union and before the beginning of the Iraq War. The Romans maintained peace, for one thing, by leaving local populations pretty much alone when it came to local customs, religions, and living arrangements. When they thought it was necessary, they maintained peace by destroying communities and forcibly moving populations. But they tried to do that only when they needed to do so to keep their absolute control. The Romans prospered by taxation. They did hold censuses, not universal ones, as mentioned in the Bible, but local censuses, in order to keep taxes high and fully paid. But the Romans themselves didn't want to be bothered with collecting taxes. So they would have local, sort of higher class local elites would bid for the right to collect local taxes. And so the Romans would take the highest bid. In other words, if I'm a rich, wealthy person in Corinth, I'll say, I'll be the local tax collector, and I'll guarantee you I'll send to Rome this amount of money per year. Of course, the Romans didn't care then how much I charged you, the people of Corinth and its area. Actually, the city of Corinth wouldn't have been taxed because it was a Roman colony, and one of the benefits of being a Roman colony is that you didn't have to pay taxes, or at least the citizens didn't have to pay taxes. But the people in the outlying villages and towns and farms and everything would pay taxes. And if I'm the tax collector, the way I make a profit is by charging you a lot more than I need just to send to Rome. Romans didn't care about this. They just knew it was going to happen. This is the way they collected their taxes. This is why the word tax collector is such a bad word for everybody but the Romans. Why you'll see in the Gospels the term tax collectors and sinners. Why? Because the Jews didn't like the tax collectors because they were being ripped off by them. Put your hand up.
Did Matthew come from a rich background then?
Well, number one, we'll talk about who the historical Matthew is. The figure in Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, we don't know much about his actual history. He just appears. But when it calls him a tax collector, it doesn't necessarily mean that he was the one who owned the right for that whole area. It just means he could have been hired by somebody to sit at a roadside and collect taxes and tolls and stuff. So the word tax collector didn't necessarily mean that the person themselves were wealthy. But whoever had the tax, what's the English word I'm looking for? Franchise. Whoever had the tax franchise for that area would be someone from a wealthy background. But then you'd hire out other people to do the taxes. So these people, of course, were very unpopular. The Romans maintained peace to a great extent by keeping the poor poor. So the Pax Romana may have sounded great if you were an elite, but if you were not in the elite, it may have seemed more oppressive than anything. There were some other benefits, though, that the Romans did. They made travel much easier. Pompey had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, which is something that our governments can't seem to do. They built roads, maintained some communication. They had a mail service, although it was for official use only, but this meant that you could get, at least the Roman officials could get mail delivered fairly quickly. They used even a horseback relay that could go 100 kilometers a day. Soldiers were expected to be able to travel 30 kilometers per day in full pack. And that was only possible because besides using the sea, the shipping lanes for travel, which was much faster than overland travel, the Romans maintained roads. They didn't really care about roads for everybody else. They wanted the roads for their army, just like the U.S. interstate system was originally created for in case the army needed to be moved across the country very quickly if the Soviets attacked. So this is the same way with the Romans. They built roads for the army, but of course other people used the roads too. This was why Christianity and other things were able to spread so easily, why Paul was able to travel around the empire. He would prefer to go by sea if possible because it's much quicker, but at least he could travel on the roads that the Romans built and maintained. As far as religion, Ehrman talks about this in your textbook, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but the common Hollywood idea that the Romans were kind of oppressive of other religions or the Christians is just that, a Hollywood idea. The Romans actually were very tolerant of local religions. They didn't care what gods you worshipped. The Romans actually were very pious in the sense that they believed that whatever land they were in, they should provide sacrifices and honors for the local gods, especially the important ones. So the Romans would honor local gods, other people's gods. Every people was allowed to use their own gods. Jews, for example, since the time of Julius Caesar, who befriended the Jews because they helped him out politically a lot, he gave them certain privileges. Jews didn't have to, they could observe the Sabbath. They didn't have to do things on the Sabbath that they didn't want to. They didn't have to serve in the army. They got to observe their own religions. They weren't expected to sacrifice either to the emperor or to other gods. So the Romans basically were very tolerant. When they weren't tolerant was when some religious group or club started looking like they might be rebellious. If they started looking like insurrection would happen, the Romans didn't do it. So the Romans, for example, outlawed volunteer fire departments in local places because they were afraid that volunteer fire departments could be a place where locals, especially maybe lower class locals, could get together and then start gossiping about what they could do to cause trouble for the Romans. So the Romans were only concerned about religions when it looked like those religions were going to cause political problems. As we'll see next time, Jews fell into the system in many different ways. Sometimes they were relatively happy clients of the Romans. Sometimes they were subversive enemies of the Roman order. As I said, they were officially recognized by the Romans, but this caused problems for Jews sometimes. In Alexandria, the local Egyptian population resented the Jews because they were recognized as a legal ethnicity in Alexandria. And they weren't given complete privileges of the Greeks in Alexandria was a Greek city, so there were Greek-speaking, maybe people of Greek descent, but if they had fully adopted Greek customs, they were considered Greeks. The Jews were not considered Greeks, but at least they were higher in status in Alexandrian law than local Egyptians. The Egyptians were the lowest in the city. So the local Egyptians resented the Jews because the Jews were recognized as their own ethnicity and given some privileges. So this is why you sometimes had Jews getting in trouble with local groups and have violence with Jews in different places. And sure enough, pogroms arise in places. Local people would attack the Jews, or the Jews would try to set up an extra big meeting house for themselves, and it would cause local problems. But these were not problems brought on by the Romans. These were local problems, and part of it was precisely because the Jews had been recognized by the Romans as having a special status in some places, and this caused some kind of local resentment. As we'll see, though, the very fact that the Romans had allowed this one universal empire that had been created by Alexander originally, and with a Greek veneer, and they allowed the West to stay Latin and the East to stay Greek, and they melded these two different things. All of this was one of the reasons that Christianity was able to spread at this time in the way it did. In fact, you might even think that had Jesus come and had Paul lived, had they tried to spread this new group, this new movement at a time 500 years before this or 500 years afterwards, it may have never happened, because it was precisely because of this one world that run by the Romans and maintained by the Romans that allowed the spread of Christianity to a great extent, both ideologically and, thought-wise, as well as simply physically. Any questions? Okay, time's up. See you not on Monday, but on Wednesday. The chronological end of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible